Sarah Blake had always cherished her morning walks across the Golden Gate Bridge. It was her time to clear her head, to breathe in the crisp air of San Francisco, and to gather herself before another busy day at her salon. But today felt different. The fog was thick, hanging low over the water like a curtain that refused to rise. Her pace was slower than usual, her thoughts a little heavier, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. As she neared the center of the bridge, something caught her eye. A man stood motionless by the railing, his posture rigid, his back to her, staring out into the void. There was something unsettling about the way he gripped the cold metal bar, his knuckles white with tension. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had encountered people in pain before, but this felt different. This felt urgent. She quickened her steps, her boots echoing softly against the concrete, her pulse racing. As she approached him, the weight of his despair seemed almost tangible. He didn't glance back, didn't acknowledge her presence, and that made her worry more. Something in her gut told her this man was teetering on the edge, not just physically, but emotionally. Sarah wasn't one to shy away from uncomfortable situations, especially when someone was in need. She wasn't sure what compelled her to speak, but her voice came out steady, firm. "You shouldn't go to that meeting today," she said, standing a few feet behind him. Her words hung in the air, a strange choice, but somehow, she knew it was right. The man stiffened but didn't turn around. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Then, slowly, he straightened, as if her words had pulled him back from the precipice. Finally, he turned, and Sarah was met with the hollow gaze of a man she immediately recognized. Michael Roberts. The Michael Roberts, a billionaire philanthropist known around the world for his charitable endeavors. His face was plastered on the covers of magazines, his name mentioned in every major news outlet. But now, standing before her, he looked like a shell of the man she had read about. His eyes, once full of life, were now clouded with sorrow and exhaustion. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then hesitated, as if the weight of his own despair had stolen his voice. Michael blinked, his eyes searching Sarah's face as if trying to make sense of her words. He looked over his shoulder, glancing down at the swirling water below, then back at her. Confusion flickered in his expression, but it was quickly swallowed by the hollow numbness that had consumed him. "How did you know about the meeting?" he asked, his voice low, barely audible over the wind. There was no accusation, just a quiet disbelief. Sarah didn't flinch. She hadn't known about the meeting. She didn't even know who he was when she first approached him. But there was no time for explanations, no space for logic. She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "It doesn't matter," she replied softly. "What matters is that you're here. You're here, and something stopped you. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was something else. But now you're standing on this bridge, and you don't have to go anywhere else." Michael's brow furrowed, his lips parting slightly as if to protest, but nothing came out. He just stood there, frozen in place, the enormity of his situation pressing down on him. Sarah could see it in his posture. The weight he carried was unbearable, crushing. He looked like a man who had run out of options. "I don't even know why I'm here," he whispered, more to himself than to her. His hands released the railing, falling limply to his sides. He glanced down at them as if they belonged to someone else. Sarah took another step, now just a breath away from him. Her voice softened, but the intensity of her words remained. "Maybe you don't know right now. Maybe you won't know for a while. But the fact that you're here, the fact that you're still standing, that's enough for today." For the first time since they had locked eyes, Michael looked away. His gaze drifted out to the horizon, where the fog had started to lift, revealing a sliver of the bay beneath. He inhaled deeply, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort, as if breathing itself had become a task too difficult to bear. Sarah stayed silent, letting him have that moment. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. There was no need to fill the space with empty platitudes or forced optimism. The air between them was thick with the unsaid, and that was enough. After what felt like an eternity, Michael finally spoke again, his voice barely above a murmur. "I was supposed to sign the papers today. A merger, huge, global. Everything's been leading to this. My career, my reputation, everything. But something didn't feel right. He paused, his eyes darkening as the weight of his next words settled over him. If I had gone through with it, I'd have lost everything that actually mattered. They would have destroyed me. Sarah exhaled slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea how close he had come to ruining his life. But now that he was talking, she could feel the tension in him start to ease. Just slightly. Then don't sign them, she said simply. Michael turned to face her fully for the first time, his expression a mix of exhaustion and confusion, like a man just waking from a long nightmare. I didn't, he replied, the ghost of something like relief crossing his face. I didn't sign anything. Sarah felt the shift in Michael, subtle but present. The tension in his face had softened, if only slightly, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from his chest. But she knew from experience that this was just the beginning. The real battle, the one inside him, was far from over. Michael glanced back toward the city, his eyes distant. I thought if I could just build something bigger, something meaningful, it would drown out everything else. The guilt, the loneliness, all of it. Sarah remained quiet, sensing that he needed to let it out, that this moment was more for him than for her. All the money, all the success, none of it fixed anything. It just masked it. He paused, his voice faltering. But you knew that, didn't you? Somehow you knew. She looked at him, her expression soft but unwavering. I didn't know, Michael, but I've seen that look before. The one you had on the bridge. Michael studied her face, his brow furrowing in thought. Why did you stop? What made you say something? Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The truth was, she wasn't sure herself. There had been something about him, something about the way he stood on that bridge, as if he were already halfway gone. She had felt it in her gut, a pull she couldn't ignore. I don't know, she admitted, but I couldn't just walk by and do nothing. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe... She trailed off, unsure of how to explain it. Michael nodded slowly, as if understanding without needing her to finish. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city buzzed quietly in the background, but on that bridge, it felt like they were a world away, suspended between the past and whatever came next. Finally, Michael broke the silence. You saved me, Sarah. Her heart ached at the rawness in his voice, but she shook her head. I didn't save you. You made that choice yourself. I was just there. He turned to her, a flicker of something unfamiliar. Maybe gratitude, maybe confusion, crossing his face. I don't think you realize what you did. If I had gone to that meeting today, if you hadn't said something... He didn't finish the thought, but Sarah understood. She could see it in his eyes, the lingering fear of what might have been. And in that moment, she realized just how close Michael had come to losing everything. Not just his career, but his life. She took a step closer, her voice low but steady. You don't have to face this alone, Michael. You don't have to keep carrying all of this by yourself. For the first time, Michael seemed to really hear her. His eyes, once so distant, now met hers with an intensity that caught her off guard. I don't know how to do that, he whispered. I don't even know where to start. Sarah gave him a small, reassuring smile. Then let's figure it out. Together. There was a long pause as Michael processed her words, his gaze searching her face for any sign of doubt. But all he found was sincerity. Finally, he exhaled, a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. Okay, he said, the word barely a whisper, but it held the weight of a promise. Sarah nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. This wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. And for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The days after their encounter on the bridge passed in a blur. Sarah didn't expect to hear from Michael again. She had done what she could, and people like him, wealthy, powerful, usually didn't stay in touch. But 3 days later, while she was sweeping hair off the salon floor, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Can we meet? I need to talk. There was no name, but Sarah knew immediately who it was. She stared at the message for a long moment, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to say no, to keep the distance between them. She wasn't a therapist. She wasn't trained to handle whatever Michael was going through. But another part of her, the part that had stopped on that bridge, knew she couldn't turn him away. That evening, they met at a small coffee shop near the pier, far from the polished world of corporate meetings and luxury living. Michael arrived looking different than she remembered. The sharp edges of his perfectly tailored suit were gone, replaced by a more casual, worn jacket. But the exhaustion, the weight in his eyes, remained. He sat down across from her, his hands clasped tightly around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. For a while, neither of them spoke. Sarah waited, sensing he needed time to find the words. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I thought I had everything figured out. The charities, the mergers, the public image. But none of it was real. I was just running." His voice was quiet, almost lost in the noise of the cafe. "And now, I don't know who I am without all of it." Sarah listened intently, her heart aching for him. She had seen people struggle before, but there was something especially tragic about someone who had everything on the outside and nothing on the inside. She leaned forward, her gaze steady on him. "You're still you, Michael. You're just lost right now. But that doesn't mean you can't find your way back." He looked up, his eyes locking with hers, searching for something. "Hope? Maybe. But what if I can't?" His voice cracked, betraying the fear he'd been holding in. "What if I've gone too far?" Sarah shook her head, her tone firm but gentle. "You're here, aren't you? You're sitting in front of me, asking for help. That means you haven't gone too far. You just need to stop running." Michael stared at her, the words sinking in. For a moment, he said nothing, just absorbed what she had said. Then, slowly, he nodded, as if making some unspoken agreement with himself. "I've been hiding for a long time," he admitted. "Behind work, behind the money, behind this version of myself I didn't even recognize anymore. But now I don't know where to go from here." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You start small. You rebuild, piece by piece. And maybe this time, you build something real, something that isn't just for show." Michael blinked, considering her words. It was clear that the idea terrified him, but there was also something else, something like relief. "I don't know if I can do it alone." "You won't have to," Sarah replied softly. "You're not alone anymore." The words hung between them, offering a kind of comfort that neither had expected. For the first time in a long while, Michael didn't feel the crushing weight of isolation, and Sarah, though unsure of what lay ahead, felt a quiet certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Their journey was just beginning, but sitting across from each other in that small cafe, it felt like they were finally moving in the right direction. The next few weeks unfolded like a delicate dance, tentative, uncertain, yet undeniably transformative. Sarah and Michael fell into a rhythm of unexpected companionship, meeting at the cafe every few days, sometimes in the early morning before the city fully woke, other times late in the evening when the world seemed quieter. What began as guarded conversations grew into something deeper, more honest. Each meeting peeled back another layer of Michael's carefully constructed armor, exposing the vulnerable man beneath. Michael often brought up his past, bits and pieces of a life that seemed glamorous on the surface but hollow at its core. He talked about the pressure to keep expanding, the unrelenting chase for success that never seemed to end. There was no joy in his voice, just an empty recollection of boardrooms, negotiations, and extravagant galas where he played a role he had grown to despise. One night, as rain tapped gently against the cafe window, he stared at his untouched drink and murmured, "You know, when I started out, I really believed I could change the world. I thought every decision I made, every deal, would have a lasting impact. But somewhere along the way, I lost that vision. I became just another businessman." Sarah leaned forward, sensing that this was important. "You're not just anything, Michael. You've done more good than most people could dream of. That's something real." "But it doesn't feel real," he said quietly, his eyes darkening. "It feels tainted, like I gave up too much of myself for the success." The pain in his voice was raw, unfiltered. Sarah felt a pang of sadness for him, but she pushed it aside, determined to keep him anchored. "Then let's start over. Do something different. Something you believe in again? He looked at her, surprised. Start over? Just like that? Yes, just like that, she said, holding his gaze. If what you're doing doesn't mean anything to you, then why keep doing it? You have the power to choose a different path. Michael fell silent, her words reverberating through him. He had never thought of it that way, never considered that he could simply choose something else. The idea was almost frightening in its simplicity. But then, as if a switch flipped, he made a decision. Okay, I want to help people, but not from behind a desk. I need to be out there, doing something real. Sarah smiled softly. Then come see what real looks like. The next day, she took him to the community center where she volunteered. It was a world far removed from his sleek offices and boardroom meetings. The building was old, its paint chipped and fading, but it thrummed with life. Children ran through the halls, their laughter echoing, while adults bustled around, setting up for the evening meal program. Michael stood in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the scene. It was chaotic and loud, the complete opposite of the meticulously controlled environments he was used to. But there was something else here, something that drew him in, an energy, a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. Sarah introduced him to the staff, people who worked tirelessly with little recognition and even less pay. Their eyes lit up when they heard his name, but it wasn't the usual flash of awe or greed he had grown accustomed to. It was genuine appreciation. So, this is where you spend your time? Michael asked Sarah later, watching as she helped a young girl sort through donated clothes. Part of it, she replied with a smile. I started volunteering a few years ago, cutting hair for people who couldn't afford it. But then, it became more. I realized that sometimes, all people need is someone who's willing to show up. He looked around, taking in the worn tables, the mismatched chairs, the walls covered in drawings from the local kids. It was simple, even rough around the edges, but there was a warmth here that he hadn't felt in any of his high-rise offices or lavish parties. It's not much, he said quietly. It's everything, Sarah countered gently, because it's real. Every smile, every thank you, it's real. Something shifted in Michael then, something small but profound. He rolled up his sleeves and spent the rest of the afternoon with her, serving meals, chatting with the families, even getting down on his knees to help a boy tie his shoelaces. It felt strange, unfamiliar, but also right. At the end of the day, as they stood outside the center, Michael looked at Sarah, a new light in his eyes. I want to do more. I don't know how, but I want to help. Sarah nodded, seeing the sincerity in his expression. You will. Just take it one step at a time. Michael took a deep breath, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of hope. Maybe he really could rebuild himself, piece by piece. And maybe, just maybe, this time it would be something worth keeping. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind. Michael threw himself into the work at the community center with an intensity that caught even Sarah off guard. He was there almost every day, helping with everything from sorting donations to organizing events. The transformation was startling. Gone was the polished, aloof businessman. In his place stood a man willing to get his hands dirty, to immerse himself in something raw and unfiltered. But as the honeymoon phase of his newfound purpose faded, reality set in. The challenges of the community center were immense, and Michael, accustomed to instant results, began to feel the strain. He was pouring time and resources into projects that seemed to make only a small dent in the overwhelming needs of the community. The frustration was evident in his every movement, his every sigh. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, he and Sarah sat alone in the small, makeshift office at the back of the center. The place was quiet now, the chaos of the day replaced by a heavy stillness. Michael stared at a stack of papers in front of him. Requests for help, lists of supplies they needed but didn't have, names of families struggling to get by. His shoulders slumped, the weight of it all bearing down on him. I don't get it, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. No matter how much I do, it's never enough. It's like trying to fill a bucket with holes in it. Sarah watched him, her heart aching. She knew this point would come, the moment when the reality of what he was doing would collide with his expectations. It was a lesson she'd learned the hard way herself. It's not about fixing everything, Michael, she said softly. It's about being here, about showing up and making a difference where you can, even if it's just for one person. He looked up, frustration etched across his face. But that's not who I am. I'm supposed to make big changes, to move mountains, not. He gestured helplessly at the papers. Not put band-aids on things. Her gaze didn't waver. And what if the band-aids are all we have right now? What if they're what's keeping people from falling apart? Michael let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. It's not enough. There it was, the clash between his ideals and the harsh truth of the world he was trying to change. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to close in around them, the silence thick with unspoken fears and frustrations. Then, almost without thinking, Sarah reached across the desk and took his hand. The contact was startling, grounding. Michael looked down at their intertwined fingers, his eyes widening slightly as if seeing her for the first time. "You've done so much already," she whispered. "More than most people ever will. But this," she gestured around the room, at the walls covered with pictures of smiling children and families. "This isn't about you fixing everything. It's about being present. It's about making people feel seen, valued. Sometimes that's more powerful than any big change." Michael's eyes flickered with something. Anger, maybe, or fear. He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he felt utterly exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been since that day on the bridge. He pulled his hand back, standing abruptly. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, his voice tight. "I thought I could, but—" He turned away, running a hand over his face. "I don't know how to be this person, Sarah. I've spent my whole life being the guy who makes things happen, who's in control. And now, I feel helpless." Sarah stood too, her movements slow, deliberate. "You're not helpless, Michael. You're human. And sometimes, being human means admitting that you can't do it all." His shoulders tensed, his back still to her. "What if I can't handle it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah took a step closer, her hand hovering near his arm. "Then you let other people help you. You lean on them the way they've leaned on you. You don't have to carry everything alone." He turned then, his eyes dark and stormy. "But what if I fall apart? What if I can't be the person everyone thinks I am?" There it was, the fear he had been hiding, the fear that had driven him to that bridge, to the edge of everything. Sarah's heart clenched, and she reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Then you pick up the pieces," she said softly, "and we figure it out. Together." For a moment, Michael just stood there, his gaze locked on hers, something breaking and rebuilding inside him all at once. He could feel the dam inside him straining, the years of pressure and pain threatening to burst through. And for the first time, he let it. "I'm so tired, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I've been fighting for so long, and I don't even know what I'm fighting for anymore." The words hung in the air, raw and real. Sarah moved closer, her hand sliding down to grasp his. "Then stop fighting," she murmured. "Just let go." It was as if something snapped inside him. All the walls, all the defenses he'd built around himself came crashing down. He sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. And then, like a floodgate opening, the tears came. Silent, desperate sobs that he couldn't control. Sarah knelt beside him, her arms around his shoulders, holding him as he broke. She didn't say anything, didn't try to stop the torrent of emotion. She just held him, steady and strong. As the man who had seemed invincible finally let himself fall apart. The storm passed slowly, the sobs fading into ragged breaths. Michael sat there, exhausted, his head still bowed. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, his face wet with tears. But there was something else there too, something lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. "I don't know what to do next," he admitted, his voice rough. Sarah smiled, a small, hopeful smile. "You don't have to know everything right now. Just take it one day at a time." He nodded slowly, still shaken but no longer afraid. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And as they sat there, in the quiet aftermath of his breakdown, Michael realized something. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he didn't need to. because for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone. In the days following his breakdown, Michael felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, like the quiet after a storm. He had expected to feel embarrassed, maybe even regretful, but instead, there was only a kind of peaceful resignation. For the first time, he wasn't trying to hold it all together. He was just being. Sarah noticed the change in him. There was a softness now, a willingness to let go of control that hadn't been there before. He still showed up at the community center, still threw himself into the work, but the frantic urgency was gone. Instead, he moved with purpose, his focus more on the people he was helping than the results he was achieving. One afternoon, as they worked side by side organizing a food drive, Michael glanced at Sarah, his gaze thoughtful. "You know," he began, his voice casual but with an undertone of seriousness, "I never asked how you got into all this. The volunteering, the community work." Sarah paused, her hands stilling over the cans of food she was sorting. It wasn't something she talked about often, but she knew this moment was coming. She took a deep breath, then looked up at him. "It started a few years ago," she said slowly. "I was in a really bad place. My mom had just passed away, and I felt lost, completely untethered. One day, I walked into this very center, thinking I could donate some time, maybe do something good to get out of my own head." She smiled faintly at the memory, her eyes distant. "But what I found here was so much more than I expected. I realized that helping others was a way of healing myself. It gave me purpose when I didn't have one." Michael listened, his chest tightening with empathy. He had seen glimpses of this side of her before, but hearing her say it aloud, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "You never told me that," he said softly, a note of surprise in his voice. Sarah shrugged, her smile turning bittersweet. "I guess I didn't think it mattered. Everyone has their own battles, right?" He reached out, his hand covering hers. "It matters to me." The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache, and for a moment, they just stood there, the world around them fading into the background. It struck Sarah then, how far they had come from that first, tense meeting on the bridge, how much they had both changed. After a long moment, Michael cleared his throat, his gaze shifting to the room full of volunteers and families. "I've been thinking," he began cautiously, "about what you said, about doing something that feels real. I want to use my resources, my connections, to help on a larger scale. Not in a corporate way, but personally." Sarah's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I want to start a foundation, something focused on mental health support, on providing resources to people who don't have access to help. Real, tangible help, not just funding, but counseling, support groups, crisis intervention." She stared at him, her heart swelling with pride. "Michael, that's incredible." He shook his head, his expression serious. "It's a big idea, and I'm not sure how to make it happen, but I know that it's something I need to do. I can't keep living the way I was before. I need this to mean something." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "You're already making a difference, Michael. This," she gestured to the bustling center around them, "this is just the beginning, and you're not alone. I'll help you however I can." For a moment, he couldn't speak, his throat tight with emotion. He had spent so many years feeling like an outsider in his own life, disconnected from everything and everyone. But here, with Sarah, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough, "for everything." She shook her head, smiling. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together." And as they stood there, surrounded by the hum of voices and the clatter of work, it felt like the start of something new, something real. Michael didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. Later that evening, as they left the center together, the sun setting in a blaze of colors over the city, Michael turned to Sarah, a question that had been burning inside him finally finding its way to his lips. "Why did you really stop on that bridge?" he asked quietly. "What made you reach out to me?" Sarah's steps slowed, her expression thoughtful. She glanced at him, her eyes searching his. "I saw something in you," she said finally. Something familiar. I saw someone who was drowning, and I knew I couldn't just walk away. Her words hung in the air, raw and honest. Michael felt a lump rise in his throat, the full weight of everything she had done for him settling in. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You saved me, Sarah," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "in more ways than one." She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that lit up her face. Maybe we saved each other. And in that moment, standing on the steps of the community center as the world darkened around them, Michael felt something shift deep inside him. It was as if the pieces of his life, once shattered and scattered, were slowly beginning to come together, forming a picture he could almost recognize. They stayed there for a long time, neither of them willing to break the fragile, perfect silence. Because in that stillness, in the space between what was and what could be, they found something they both thought they had lost: each other. As the weeks turned into months, Michael's vision for the foundation began to take shape. The community center became his second home, a place where his ideas grew and flourished. Every day, he was there, meeting with local leaders, organizing outreach programs, and listening to the stories of those who came through the doors. The work was grueling, often frustrating, but it was also the most fulfilling thing he had ever done. Sarah watched him with a mixture of pride and awe. He had found his footing, transforming from the broken man she had met on the bridge into someone driven by purpose and passion. But it wasn't just about the work. Michael had become a part of the community in a way that surprised even him. He knew people by name, understood their struggles, and, more importantly, they trusted him. One evening, after a long day of planning a new mental health initiative, Michael and Sarah sat on the steps outside the center. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. Michael leaned back, stretching his arms over his head, a tired but content smile on his face. "I still can't believe how far we've come," he said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "A few months ago, I felt like I was drowning. Now, it's like I can finally breathe." Sarah glanced at him, her heart swelling with emotion. "You've done amazing things, Michael. You should be proud." He shook his head, his gaze soft as it rested on her. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You've been my anchor through all of it." There was something in his voice, something deeper than gratitude. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression steady, not wanting to read too much into it. "I just gave you a little nudge in the right direction. The rest was all you." Michael turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers. "No, Sarah, it wasn't just a nudge. You saved my life." The sincerity in his tone left her breathless. She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Let me finish," he said softly. "You've been there for me in ways I didn't even know I needed. You showed me that it was okay to let go, to be vulnerable. And because of you, I've found something real, something worth fighting for." Sarah's throat tightened. She had seen him grow, had watched him transform, but hearing him say these words made everything feel more profound, more real. "I just wanted you to see what I saw in you," she whispered. Michael's gaze dropped to the ground, and for a moment, he seemed almost shy. Then he looked back up, his eyes intense. "I think I see it now, and I want to be that person, not just for the foundation or the community, but for you, too." The air between them felt charged, filled with unspoken possibilities. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, the words she had been holding back for so long pressing against her lips. But before she could speak, Michael's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "It's my attorney," he said, the tension returning to his voice. "I've been dealing with some issues regarding my business assets, and it's complicated." Sarah frowned, the warmth of the moment evaporating. "What's going on?" Michael hesitated, his gaze drifting back to the city skyline. "There are people who don't like what I'm doing, who think I'm wasting my resources. They're pushing back, trying to force me to sell parts of my business. If I don't, it could get ugly." A cold knot of fear tightened in Sarah's stomach. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He shook his head, his expression hardening. "No, this is something I need to handle on my own. But it's not just about me. If they get their way, everything we've built here could be at risk. The thought of losing the foundation, of seeing Michael's work unravel, filled her with a deep, protective anger. "That's not going to happen," she said fiercely. "We won't let them take this away." Michael looked at her, a flicker of a smile breaking through his worry. "I love how fierce you are," he murmured, his voice soft. "But I don't want you caught in the crossfire. I need you to promise me something." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Anything? Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll keep fighting for this place, for these people, even if I can't." The intensity in his eyes took her breath away. "Michael, promise me," he insisted, his voice breaking with emotion. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she nodded, her voice steady. "I promise." He reached out, taking her hand, his grip warm and strong. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them. But in that quiet moment, despite the fear and uncertainty, there was something else, something strong and unbreakable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael knew that whatever happened next, he wasn't alone. And for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever the future held. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging Michael had ever faced. The opposition against him grew stronger, more relentless. Board members, former allies, and even old friends began questioning his decisions, pushing back against the changes he was trying to implement. Every day seemed like a new battle, and Michael found himself standing at the center of a storm he wasn't sure he could weather. But he kept his promise to Sarah. He kept showing up at the community center, kept fighting for the foundation, even as everything around him seemed to be falling apart. There were late-night meetings with lawyers, tense phone calls, and sleepless nights spent poring over documents. The weight of it all was suffocating, and there were moments when the fear of losing everything threatened to overwhelm him. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of negotiations, Michael arrived at the center, his nerves frayed and his heart heavy. The place was quiet, most of the volunteers having left for the night. He found Sarah in the small office at the back, going through a stack of donation receipts. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that he desperately needed to see. But then her expression shifted, concern clouding her eyes as she took in his weary appearance. "Michael, what's wrong?" she asked softly, standing and crossing the room to him. He let out a long, ragged breath, running a hand through his hair. "Everything. I feel like I'm losing control. The business is in chaos, and the board is threatening to pull funding from the foundation if I don't sell off assets. It's a nightmare." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "They can't do that. This foundation is helping so many people. They can't just take it away." "They can, and they will," he said bitterly. "They don't care about the people we're helping. All they see are the numbers, the profit margins. And they think I've lost my mind, pouring money into something that doesn't make a return." His voice cracked with frustration, and he turned away, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what to do, Sarah. I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose everything we've built." Sarah's heart broke for him. She could see how much he was struggling, how close he was to breaking. Without thinking, she reached out, wrapping her arms around him, holding him tight. "You're not going to lose it," she whispered fiercely. "We're not going to lose it. We'll find a way." Michael's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and for a moment, he just held on, letting her strength ground him. He closed his eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, the warmth of her presence soothing the jagged edges of his fear. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle." Sarah pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes fierce. "You are strong enough. You've already proven that. And you're not fighting alone. We're in this together, remember?" He stared down at her, something breaking open inside him at her words. She had been his rock through all of this, his constant, unwavering support. And now, looking into her eyes, he felt something shift, something that had been building between them from the very beginning. Without thinking, he leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel his heart pounding, could see the raw vulnerability in his eyes. Her hands slid up to cup his face, her thumbs brushing gently over his cheeks. "You don't have to find out," she murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop, the air between them charged with something electric, something inevitable. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Michael's lips found hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, as if they were both afraid to break the fragile moment. But then it deepened, a surge of emotion and longing that left them both breathless. It was like everything they had been holding back, all the fears and hopes and unspoken words, poured into that one kiss. When they finally broke apart, they were both trembling, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. Michael's hands were still in her hair, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I." But before he could finish, the door to the office swung open, and a volunteer stuck her head in, her eyes wide with urgency. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation in the main hall. There's a family that just came in, and it's bad." Michael and Sarah pulled apart, the spell between them shattered by the intrusion. But as they exchanged a glance, there was no regret, only a silent understanding that this conversation wasn't over. "Let's go," Michael said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions still swirling inside him. They followed the volunteer to the main hall, where a small crowd had gathered. In the center of the room was a young mother, her face pale and drawn, clutching a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. Two small children huddled beside her, their eyes wide with fear. Michael's heart twisted at the sight. He stepped forward, his voice calm and reassuring. "What's going on here?" The woman looked up, tears streaming down her face. We have nowhere to go," she choked out. "We've been living in our car for weeks, but now it's gone. I don't know what to do." The desperation in her voice was palpable, and Michael felt a surge of anger. Anger at a world that could be so cruel, at the system that had failed this family, at himself for ever thinking he could give up this fight. He crouched down, his voice gentle. "It's okay. You're safe here. We'll help you." The woman looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time. "You will?" He nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out." As Sarah knelt beside him, offering the children warm smiles and comforting words, Michael felt something click into place inside him. This was why he was fighting. This was what mattered. And no boardroom battle, no financial setback, could take this away from him. They spent the next few hours arranging temporary housing for the family, organizing donations of clothes and food, and connecting them with social services. It was exhausting, draining work, but as the mother hugged him, tears of gratitude in her eyes, Michael knew without a doubt that this was where he was meant to be. Later, as he and Sarah walked out of the center, the weight of the night settling over them, he took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you for reminding me why I'm doing this." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You didn't need me to remind you. You've always known." He smiled, a real, genuine smile that felt like it came from deep inside. "Maybe, but it's nice to have someone to share it with." And as they stood there, under the dim streetlights, the world around them quiet and still, Michael realized something. No matter what happened next, no matter what battles lay ahead, he wasn't afraid anymore. Because for the first time, he wasn't fighting alone. The following weeks tested every bit of strength and resilience Michael and Sarah possessed. The board's pressure mounted, threats of legal action loomed, and the tension around the foundation grew thicker with each passing day. But through it all, Michael held firm, drawing strength from the work he was doing and from the people he was helping. Every time doubt crept in, he remembered the family they had helped that night, remembered the way the mother's eyes had lit up with hope when he promised they wouldn't be abandoned. And every time fear threatened to take over, he remembered Sarah, her unwavering belief in him, the way she had stood by his side through everything, never faltering. One night, as they were leaving the center, Sarah stopped him, her hand on his arm. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "There's something we need to do." Michael turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her gaze steady on his. We need to bring this fight to the public. We need people to see what's really happening here, to understand why this matters. If we can show them what the foundation is doing, how it's changing lives, we can get support from outside. We can put pressure on the board to back off. Michael hesitated, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. You mean go public? Like, with the media? Sarah nodded. Exactly. We tell our story. Your story. We show them who you really are, what you're fighting for. It's risky, but I think it's our best shot. He glanced around, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. Going public would mean exposing himself in a way he never had before. It would mean laying everything bare, taking a stand that could either save everything or destroy it all. But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw the determination there, the fire that had carried him through the darkest moments, and he knew she was right. This was bigger than him, bigger than his pride or his fears. This was about the people they were fighting for, the lives they were trying to change. Okay, he said finally, his voice steady. Let's do it. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and strategizing. They reached out to local news stations, crafted a powerful narrative about the foundation, and gathered testimonials from families and individuals whose lives had been transformed. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, but there was a sense of purpose driving them both, a belief that this was their best chance. The day of the press conference dawned cold and clear. The community center was buzzing with energy, reporters setting up cameras and microphones, volunteers bustling around with last-minute preparations. Michael stood in the back room, his heart pounding as he adjusted his tie, the enormity of what they were about to do settling over him. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her presence instantly calming him. She looked beautiful, poised and confident, and the sight of her gave him the strength he needed. She walked over, reaching up to straighten his collar. "You're going to be amazing," she said softly, her eyes shining with pride. He took a deep breath, his hand closing over hers. "I'm nervous." "I know," she replied, smiling, "but you're also ready. You've got this." He nodded, her words grounding him. Then, leaning down, he pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for everything." They stood there for a moment, the world outside fading away, and then, with a final squeeze of her hand, he turned and walked out to face the crowd. The press conference was intense. Michael spoke with a passion that surprised even himself, laying out his vision for the foundation, the work they were doing, and the obstacles they were facing. He talked about the families they had helped, the lives that had been changed, and his commitment to fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But it wasn't just his words that made an impact. It was his vulnerability, his willingness to be honest about his own struggles, his own journey. He talked about the night on the bridge, about how close he had come to giving up, and how the work at the community center had saved him as much as anyone else. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I've lost sight of what really matters. But this foundation, this community, it's given me a second chance. And I'm not going to let anyone take that away." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. And then, slowly, one by one, people began to clap. It started as a low murmur, then grew, filling the space with a roar of support and approval. Michael glanced at Sarah, his heart swelling at the pride in her eyes. He knew this was just the beginning, that there were still battles ahead. But in that moment, surrounded by the applause and the sense of something bigger than himself, he felt a surge of hope, of possibility. The media coverage that followed was overwhelming. Stories about the foundation and Michael's personal transformation spread like wildfire, garnering support from across the country. Donations poured in, along with messages of encouragement and offers of help. The board, seeing the wave of public support, began to back down, the threat of dismantling the foundation slowly fading. But it wasn't just the foundation that was saved. Something had shifted in Michael, a new clarity and resolve taking root. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was an advocate, a leader, and he was determined to keep fighting for what he believed in. One evening, after another long day at the center, he and Sarah stood on the rooftop, looking out over the city. The air was crisp, the stars bright against the dark sky. Michael reached out, his hand finding hers, and they stood there in silence. the weight of everything they had been through settling around them like a blanket. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the stillness. "But I know that whatever it is, I'm not afraid anymore." Sarah squeezed his hand, her gaze soft. "You shouldn't be. Look at everything you've done. Look at how far you've come." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "It's not just me. I couldn't have done any of this without you." She smiled, leaning into him. "We make a good team, don't we?" He laughed softly, pulling her closer. "The best." And as they stood there, the city lights twinkling below them, Michael felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The battles ahead would come, and he would face them, but for now, he was content. He had found his purpose, his place, and he wasn't alone. But just as they turned to go back inside, Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. It was a message from his attorney. "We need to talk. Urgent." His heart skipped a beat, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He showed the message to Sarah, his mind racing with possibilities. What now? What could be so urgent? She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it. Together." He nodded, taking a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. Because if there was one thing he had learned through all of this, it was that he could face anything, as long as he wasn't facing it alone. And as they walked back inside, side by side, he knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. Because this was just the beginning. The sense of calm that Michael and Sarah had found was fleeting. As they made their way back into the community center that night, Michael's mind raced with possibilities. Urgent messages from his attorney rarely meant good news. He dialed the number, his hand tightening around the phone as it rang, each second feeling like an eternity. When his attorney's voice came through the line, it was laced with tension. "Michael, there's been a development. I just got off the phone with one of the board members. They're not backing down like we thought. They found a legal loophole, something buried deep in the original contracts. If they push this, they could take everything. The foundation, the community center, all of it." Michael felt his stomach drop, a cold wave of fear washing over him. "What do you mean, take everything? We've already gotten so much support, public, financial. How can they still do this?" "It's complicated, but they're arguing that your recent actions have put the company and its assets at risk. They're claiming that your mental state at the time you set up the foundation makes you unfit to manage it. If they succeed, they could gain control of everything." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He leaned against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known the fight wouldn't be easy, but this felt like the ground was being pulled out from under him. Sarah, who had been watching him closely, moved closer, her hand resting on his arm. "What is it? What's wrong?" He shook his head, struggling to find his voice. "They're trying to take everything, Sarah. Everything we've worked for. They're saying I'm unfit to run the foundation." Her eyes widened, shock and anger flashing across her face. "What? How can they even?" Michael held up his hand, stopping her. "I don't know, but we need to figure this out. Now." He turned his attention back to his attorney. "What are our options?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We can fight it, but it's going to be a tough battle. They've already lined up expert witnesses, psychologists willing to testify that your state of mind was compromised when you made the decisions regarding the foundation. If we go to court, it's going to get ugly." Michael closed his eyes, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. He felt trapped, as if all the progress they had made was slipping through his fingers. He looked at Sarah, desperation in his gaze. She stepped closer, her voice firm and steady. "We're not giving up, Michael. There has to be a way." He nodded slowly, the resolve in her voice sparking something inside him. "We have to find a way to prove that I'm still capable of leading this, that the foundation isn't at risk because of me." His attorney sighed. "That's easier said than done, Michael. But there might be one option, something unconventional. We could bring in character witnesses, people who can speak to your transformation, to the work you've been doing here. It won't be easy, but if we can show that you're not the same person you were when all this started, it might be enough to sway the judge." Michael glanced around the center, the images of the people they'd helped flashing through his mind. He thought of the families, the children, all the lives that had been touched because of the foundation. And he thought of Sarah, of everything they had been through together, of the promise he had made to her and to himself. "Then we do it," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes, we'll fight this." After ending the call, Michael felt a surge of determination, but there was still a gnawing fear at the back of his mind. He turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "We're going to need help. A lot of it. Are you with me?" She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Always." The next few days were a blur of activity. Michael and Sarah reached out to everyone they could think of: volunteers, families who had benefited from the foundation, local leaders who had seen the impact firsthand. Slowly, people began to rally around them, their support unwavering. But as the court date loomed closer, the stress took its toll. Michael found himself battling old demons, the fear and doubt creeping back in. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. What if they lost? What if everything they had built came crashing down? It was during one of those sleepless nights that Sarah found him in the empty community center, staring out the window at the darkened street below. She walked up beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. "You're not alone in this, you know," she said softly. He nodded, his throat tight. I can't help thinking, what if I fail? What if they take it all?" Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "Then we fight back. We rebuild, no matter what happens. But you're not going to fail, Michael. You've come too far." He looked at her, the fear and uncertainty in his eyes slowly giving way to something stronger. "I don't want to lose this, Sarah. I don't want to lose you." She smiled, a tender, knowing smile that made his heart ache. "You won't. I'm not going anywhere, remember?" He took a deep breath, the tightness in his chest easing slightly. "I know. It's hard." "I know it is," she said, reaching out to cup his face in her hands. "But you're one of the strongest people I know, Michael. You've already faced so much. You can handle this, too." He leaned into her touch, drawing strength from her words. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered. "Luckily, you won't have to find out," she teased gently, her eyes shining with unshed tears. They stayed like that for a long moment, the world outside falling away. And in that quiet, in the stillness of the empty center, Michael felt something shift. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, but it was tempered now by a sense of hope, of possibility. The court hearing was grueling. The board's lawyers were relentless, painting Michael as reckless, unfit, a man whose actions were driven more by guilt and desperation than true conviction. But Michael and Sarah held their ground, presenting a different narrative, a story of redemption, of transformation, of a man who had found purpose and hope in the very work they were now trying to take away. Witness after witness took the stand, speaking passionately about the foundation, about the lives it had touched, the change it had brought to the community. Parents, teachers, volunteers, they all stood up, their voices clear and unwavering. And then it was Sarah's turn. She took the stand, her gaze never leaving Michael's as she began to speak. "When I met Michael, he was at his lowest, but I saw something in him, a strength, a desire to make things right. He's not perfect, none of us are, but he's dedicated his life to helping others, to making a difference. And if that's not enough to lead this foundation, then I don't know what is." Her words echoed through the courtroom, the silence that followed thick with emotion. Michael felt his heart swell, a fierce pride and love for this woman who had stood by him through everything, who had believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. As she stepped down, their eyes met, and in that single glance, he felt everything they had fought for, everything they had built, crystallize into a moment of pure, unshakable resolve. The judge's decision came later that afternoon. The room was tense, every breath held as the judge read through the ruling. And then, with a final, decisive tone, he announced the verdict. Michael would retain control of the foundation. The board's motion was denied. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, followed by cheers and tears and embraces. Michael felt a weight lift off his shoulders, a sense of victory and gratitude flooding through him. He turned to Sarah, pulling her into his arms, his voice breaking with emotion. "We did it," he whispered, his eyes shining. "We actually did it." She held him tight, her own tears falling freely. "No, Michael, you did it. You proved to everyone what I've known all along." He pulled back, his hands framing her face. "And what's that?" She smiled, a smile that lit up the room, that made everything else fade away. "That you're a good man, a strong man, and that no matter what, you'll always find a way." He leaned down, their foreheads touching, his heart full to bursting. "I love you, Sarah," he whispered, the words spilling out before he could stop them. She looked up at him, her eyes soft, her voice trembling with joy. "I love you too." And as they stood there, surrounded by their friends, their community, their family, Michael knew that this was only the beginning. Because no matter what challenges lay ahead, no matter what battles they still had to face, they would face them together. They had found something real, something worth fighting for. And together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.